Good afternoon, Kat Fitzpatrick here, picking up where I left off on my reading of For the Love of Vietnam, A War, a Family, a CIA official, and the best evacuation story never heard. Today, I really wanted to record a video, and also to kayak, and I decided to do both. You are now seeing the effects of the Hudson River traffic. I do love some waves, so I don't mind. I hope you don't. I'm going to pick up where I left off on page 27, The Ghost of Stalin and The Love of Vietnam. The image here is a book cover called Is This Tomorrow? America Under Communism. It was a 1950s Red Scare propaganda comic book by F. Robert Edmond, Francis McGrade, and Charles Schultz. He was the illustrator. The chapter is Stalin's Ghost and the Love of Vietnam. In hindsight, it's easy to recognize what a mess Vietnam was. It's an easy thing to say that James Welch should not have been so worried about the threat of communism. But can we really imagine what it was like to have come of age in a time of Hitler and the Nazis? To have been influenced by McCarthyism and the Red Scare? All things considered, it's easy to think that he should have packed his bags and given up the question of Vietnam sooner rather than later. Certainly long before the U.S. pullout in 1975. However, even if he could have left the intelligence service that quickly, for a spy, that would have been tantamount to desertion. He was loyal to his country and staunch in his quest to defeat communism, a conviction born of the commonly held belief in the domino theory. That theory held that should Vietnam fall to communist rule, the rest of Asia would quickly follow, and perhaps the rest of the world too. Again, at that time there was good reason to fear communism. Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin had killed 20 million of his own citizens between 1929 and 1953, and Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Communist Party of China, had killed 45 million of his own people between 58 and 62. Their legacies hung in the minds of Western policymakers like tattered red banners. I was fighting the ghost of Stalin, Welch said, by way of explaining his dogged fight against the North Vietnamese communists. But there was more to his persistence than the fear of communist takeover. That is, he loved South Vietnam. Maybe I am just reflecting the exuberance of the season, he wrote home early in 1974. But especially right now, I feel a very great closeness to Vietnam and the Vietnamese people. From the ragged kids in the streets, to the elegant ladies at the cathedral, to the great talents I meet every day at the studio. The season he was speaking of was Tet, the Vietnamese New Year celebration, which can last as long as 2 weeks. One Monday, he arrived at work to find the revelry had not ended the Friday before as he had expected. There was the uproarious street celebration outside House 7. Much to his surprise, a group of his employees surrounded him, steering him around a big truck decorated with a huge papier-mâché dragon, through the dancing and drumming revelers, and into a radio control room where they began to shower their blessings upon him. Nguyen Dung, one of the 4 Vietnamese Beatles, which was the most famous band of musicians in those days, grabbed his hand and made a long speech, wishing him and his family good fortune. Naturally, I didn't understand a word of it, and I thought I would never get my hand back, he wrote. Even though I don't know much more than Hai Mat Ba in Vietnamese, I have been taken as a real friend by so many of these people that I'm nearly overwhelmed. Especially since there are so many I can't converse with at all. In that, I feel sort of like JFK when he told the people in Berlin, Ich bin ein Berliner. There's more on that in the next page. He began his commitment to Vietnam out of fear of communism, but ended up being committed up to his chin, he wrote, in the cause of the people he was fighting for. He admitted to being an eternal optimist and would not entertain the thought that his efforts were wasted. They are great people, he wrote, and I will not concede 1 inch to the communists. His dedication was only bolstered by reports that confirmed that communist troops were becoming more and more dispirited, and that more and more were defecting to the South. Whether this intel was accurately portrayed was a question that would arise over the next year's challenges, but he believed that his propaganda was having a decided effect on the North Vietnamese GIs, but he feared they would run out of time. Some come across having listened for a period of time to our special peacenik appeal, he wrote to his sister. We are wearing them away, but will it be soon enough? I don't know. I do know that it has gotten them worried because they are attacking us in their press, and that is always a good sign that you're hurting them. Oddly, it is our particular selections of music that seem to bother them most. The teens up there like rock and jazz, as much as kids anywhere, and have taken to growing their hair long. That sends the communist leaders right up the wall. Well, history will tell. And the definition of peacenik, in case you didn't know, it's a noun, it's derogatory, and it's informal. It means a member of a pacifist movement. So the peacenik appeal of the Mother Vietnam radio station. Again, they were broadcasting to the North Vietnamese with the idea of having them lay down their arms and come back to Mother Vietnam, or in this case, their view, South Vietnam. History has revealed many reasons why this effort was not destined for success. However, Welch strongly believed in his mission from the beginning, and he put all his energy toward designing radio broadcasts that he believed would convince North Vietnamese soldiers to lay down their arms and return to the one true mother, Mother Vietnam, communist-free South Vietnam. While he was in love with his job and heartened that his radio operation was expanding while many other embassy efforts were being economized or cut altogether, he struggled with the separation from his family. His wife and 7 children had been sent to live in the safe haven of Taiwan while he worked in Saigon. I have the job I like better than I ever have or expect to have again, he wrote home early in the separation, and the personal circumstances are the most unacceptable ever. I miss you so much. Well, for better or for worse, it will all come to an end. And here's a little sidebar here about the domino theory. This is an image of, you can see, it looks like if you push those dominoes, they're going to go right over. The domino theory was a Cold War policy that suggested a communist government taking root in one nation would quickly lead to communist takeovers in neighboring states, each falling like a perfectly aligned row of dominoes. It was the Republican president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was in office from 1953 to 1961, who first put forth this thought. At an April 1954 news conference, he explained that when you have a row of dominoes set up, you just knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly. Eisenhower's message was clear. The United States could not allow Ho Chi Minh to take over South Vietnam. The fall of South Vietnam would inevitably lead to communist expansion throughout the rest of Southeast Asia and thus the rest of the world. And here's a little sidebar, a little bit more about the speech that John F. Kennedy gave in Berlin in 1963. In his famous anti-communist speech of June 26, 1963 in West Berlin, President John F. Kennedy meant to say, "I am a Berliner." What he ostensibly said was, "I am a jelly donut or a jelly pastry." And that is what Welch was referring to when he said he felt like JFK. Kennedy's blunder came from saying, "Ich bin ein Berliner," in which he used the German indefinite article ein, which supposedly changed the meaning in the sentence from "I am a citizen of Berlin" to "I am a Berliner." Herein lies the joke, because a Berliner is essentially a jelly pastry. In similar fashion, Welch had just as tenuous a grasp on the local language. His statement that he doesn't know much more than "Hai Mat Ba" was in error. 1, 2, 3 in Vietnamese is actually Mat Hai Ba. Luckily for both men, there were competent and good-natured bilingual translators on hand who helped them through their language trials, leaving no one the worse for wear. The next chapter starts on page 33, the question of wife and family. James Welch's wife was one Nancy L. Rabdo, a vivacious party girl that he'd met when she'd arrived in Munich, Germany in 1958. She'd landed a position with fellow CIA agent Leo Small, whose office just happened to be right across the hall from Welch's. Her path as a CIA secretary had begun the year before during her sophomore year at Gonzaga University when, according to her best friend and later sister-in-law, she had become less enchanted with school and a bit more enchanted with her academic advisor. Fortunately, her advisor, in an act designed to protect his career and gently redirect the feisty young woman, had steered her away from further schooling and toward the nation's capital, where she could embark on new and exciting adventures. When the opportunity for an overseas post became available, she did not hesitate but wrote home to her parents in Idaho that she was on her way to Europe. Small described her as vivacious, full of energy. She was a very good secretary, very fast, he said. She was very pretty, very smart, and very socially active. It wasn't long before she caught the eye of Welch, and after a half-year's whirlwind romance, the couple got hitched. They had 2 wedding ceremonies, one on August 2nd in a church with the covert company, CIA members, and a smaller civil wedding on August 25th with those who knew them as ordinary government staff. Within a decade, the family had grown to include 6 children, and Nancy, of course, was no longer employed by the company, but was a full-time mother and housekeeper. She threw herself into the role the best she could, deftly juggling the endless tasks and activities of a large family. She was still up for adventure, and she took the 1970 transfer to Seoul, Korea in stride. Amid the family activities, making new friends, and exploring the countryside, she found time to volunteer for various aid organizations. One assignment had her head over heels in love with a new baby. She wrote home in late 1970 about the blessed event. We were only to watch her for a couple days, but once she arrived, we could not let her go. Jim has already signed papers to adopt her. We decided to call her Kimberly Marie, as she looks like a little Kim, full Korean and beautiful. We love her and pray there will be no hitch in the adoption. Send a prayer, it will all work out. We'd feel like we were losing one of our own if we had to give her up. Tours of duty for CIA personnel are often short-term, like much of the military. In 1972, there was a great deal of speculation about whether the family would be able to stay on in Seoul for another much-hoped-for additional year, or be called back stateside. The orders came suddenly at the beginning of the summer. James was to report to Saigon, and because South Vietnam was still considered a war zone, the family was to report to Taiwan to take up residence in the safe government housing on Grass Mountain, just north of Taipei. Though in the beginning both Jim and Nancy Welch had felt like the luckiest people in the world to have met each other, separation in the shadow of war creates a peculiar kind of stress. Fortunately, Nancy was granted a pass to visit her husband several times in 1973 and 74. She met his friends and coworkers, one of which was the vivacious radio star Mother Vietnam, My Lan. Nancy couldn't help but love the personable young woman, but noticed the favor the DJ curried with all the American personnel. She was included in every social gathering and event, from welcoming visitors such as Nancy to meeting officials in Washington. With her flawless command of English and her bright smile and charming manners, she represented South Vietnam well and gave people an image of Vietnam to which they could relate. I'm getting blown into the shore, but I will, which they could not only relate, but feel great affection for. She was not a woman anyone would soon forget. Thus, when Saigon was deemed safe for families in 1974, Nancy was all too happy to pack up the children and make the move to the capital of South Vietnam. If James were committed to the cause of the South Vietnam without his family, wouldn't he be that much more empowered when his loved ones were there to support him? And there's a quote from Frank Snep's book, Decent Interval. My Lan was an instant hit with the boys on the front line and with her American sponsors as well. So she made quite an impact embassy-wide. And then there's a little section here about auspicious August 2nd. James Welch and Nancy Rabdo were married in Munich, Germany on August 2nd, 1958. Coincidentally, their wedding day was exactly 6 years before the Tonkin Gulf incident, which catapulted the U.S. Armed Forces more deeply into Vietnam. And then 56 years later, I would unwittingly visit the Veterans Memorial in D.C. on the very weekend of their anniversary. So that was kind of a cool coincidence when I realized that came about. And another sidebar called Why Were Families in a War Zone? This is a picture of the Pan Am plane, which was one of the most common, well, it was the most popular airline around that time. And those are the planes we flew in and out of Asia on. So it wasn't until I was in high school that I finally asked my mother, why did you take all of us into Vietnam anyway? Her reply was simple. No one knew what was going to happen. In Get Out Any Way You Can, Charles Tabor wrote that early in 1974, Saigon was considered safe enough for families so they could be reunited with those stationed in the city. The question of who made that determination remains unanswered, but it was most likely Ambassador Graham Martin, who worked extremely hard at making the war situation seem better than it ever was. Saigon was not to be a family post for long, Tabor continued. The year 1974 saw the ceasefire severely tested as Hanoi pursued its war and peace campaign of continuous attacks wherever they found Saigon forces vulnerable. Indeed, it did not take long for the signs of war to show themselves to us, but we were already there and vulnerable to the blind optimism that was already inherent in the city. There's a little picture of my mom visiting, and this is a picture of the family right after we got there. We all look so young and eager. Part 2, A Family Adventure. 1974, Safe for Families. James E. Welch was my father, and Nancy L. Rabdo was my mother. And while this is their story, it can't help but be my story also. My siblings and I were moved to the doomed city of Saigon in